Joe can step out if they're going out for children's class. And welcome to our second part of the service, the teaching. This morning we're going to be talking on Anabaptism and more of the Reformation time. But welcome to church this morning. If you haven't silenced your phone, you can do that now. Watch that step down there. As we always remind people, we prefer you stay upright and not horizontal if you're walking around here. And this is the second lecture on called 500 years since the Reformation, but the church history segment. Next week we will talk about the last 500 years of Christianity. Next week is going to be focused mostly on Anabaptism and that wing of Christianity, that line. There are other lines of Christianity. We'll talk about some of those next week, but at some point we have to start narrowing it down a little bit because there's a lot of material and a lot of history to get in 3 sessions. A little bit of a background. Last week we talked about the early church, the first 1,300 years of church, and we're going to zero in a little bit on the Roman Catholic part of the early church, or of the church history now. The Eastern Church, we're not going to put much talk on that anymore. That we're going to leave last week. So the Roman Catholic Church would have been centered in Rome. That's where it got its name from. But it had influence throughout the Roman Empire. In 312, you have Constantine is going to battle, and it's now called the Battle of Meridian Bridge. And he's going to battle, and he has not had a protector god. He's not selected protector god. All the emperors would have a personal god who was their protector, head of their bodyguard. He has not selected one yet, and this has caused him great angst because without a protector god, he feels that he is going to die in battle. And there was not really a good god to choose from. All the gods that he could think of and that he liked of the Greek pantheon of gods had already been picked by another emperor, and he was kind of without a protector. There was one god, the god of Christianity, that he was kind of attracted to in some ways, but there were some problems with it. Number one, they did not believe in bearing arms, taking up arms, and he is the emperor of Rome, and so that's going to be a problem for him. But he sees a vision, and I'm not going to try to talk down his description of this, but he sees a vision, and he sees a cross, and there's a inscription underneath the cross that says, "In this name you will conquer." And so he says, that's the Christian God saying he will be my protector. And so he selects him as his personal God. Now, there's different versions of that you're going to get, depending on who you read, but that's one version. He goes to the Battle of Meridian Bridge and wins, and says, yes, the Christian God has protected me, and he is my protector, and I will be his from now on. He will be my protector. We don't know whether he gave up the pantheon of gods at that point or not. And it's kind of questionable. It depends what source you have. It'll say, oh yes, he converted to Christianity right there. I'm going to say maybe it's not quite as pure motives as sometimes we read. The next year he declares the Edict of Milan, and that makes Christianity legal. Up to this time, if you're a Christian, you were most likely going to be a second-class citizen at best, and at worst, you were going to be killed. The Edict of Milan says Christianity is legal now throughout the Roman Empire, and you can be a Christian and hold the same citizenship as everybody else. Right after that, there starts to be a problem because the churches are under one Roman Empire, and now if there is any tension in these churches, it could shatter the empire. And there is some tension, and that leads to the Council of Nicaea in 325. It's the first time that a non-Christian leader calls a council together or a convention together. And Constantine calls this convention together and says, these are a couple problems. There's 3 problems mainly. We're not going to get into those. He says, you figure it out. Told the bishops to figure it out. There's a little over 300 bishops that showed up for it, and they argued for a couple weeks, and finally they come up with a conclusion. There was a number of councils that followed. Over the next 500 years, there's lots of councils. But over the next 200 years, we're going to say, is most of the important ones. And I'm not going to go into all those this morning because we don't have time and it's not that important. 380 is the next thing that is interesting, is the Edict of Thessalonica. That's when Christianity becomes the state religion of the Roman Empire. And now, instead of being persecuted for being a Christian, if you're not a Christian, now you're persecuted. So we have a complete reversal from 60 years prior or 70 years prior. Okay, now you see a big gap in dates here. And that is because there's a lot of stuff in there that we're just going to skip over. A lot of interesting things, but we don't have time for everything. The Great Schism. This is a schism, or a dividing between the churches in the East and the churches in the West, over a number of different topics, but a lot of it has been just the way they process thinking. And they think differently, they come up with different conclusions because of that, and it creates a problem. So in 1054, the Orthodox Church, all the churches that are kind of over in the old Slavic bloc and then down into the eastern part there, they break off from the Roman Catholic Church. So you have the West Church and the East Church, and there is a division there. They have a different head. The Roman Catholic has the Pope. The Orthodox has, it's kind of hard to say what they have because it changes a few times every years, but they would have a leader or a network of leaders that oversee that church. And today the Orthodox churches do have differences depending if you're a Roman Orthodox or if you're whatever Orthodox you're part of, you would have a different system. Right at that time is what was called the Crusades. And this is a time when the Roman Church, we're leaving the Orthodox churches alone now, we're going to follow Roman down through here. The Roman Church starts to send out military expeditions to do different things. The most common ones were to go recover Israel, the Holy Lands, from the Turks or the Muslims. That was the most common ones, but they sent out probably a few dozen crusades. Some were local, some were going far, and especially during this time period, you have a lot of these crusades. So roughly 300 years, but crusades do happen even after that. They do happen for the next 300 years after the close of the main crusades. And even you could say that crusades is something that has happened even more recently. In the last 100 years, there are a few times that a crusade has kind of been called, not as officially as these, but in a way crusades continue on. That's the brief 1,000-year history of the Catholic Church up to the Reformation. Okay, the cast. I told you guys we're going to see some of these characters this morning. We're going to talk about a number of people this morning who are I'm going to call them the cast of the Reformation. People who put their stamp on the Reformation and help direct it in a certain way. None of these cartoons, are part of the cast, but it's just to help make a point. The first one is John Wycliffe. He was right early on in the Reformation. I'm going to call him part of the Reformation. He's in England, right up here. And Rome is down here, so there's a fair amount of distance. And if you remember from last year, England never really fell under Roman control that strongly. The church in England was very independent-minded. And he's up there, and he's studying, he's thinking, and he starts writing some stuff down and starts sending out letters. He insists on radical poverty for the clerics, for the clergy. The clergy at that time was a very wealthy way of going through life. You could have a life of ease, and the church would pay for all your bills, and it was not a bad life. Many times, young men would have two choices if they wanted to have a good life. They would either choose to be a lawyer or a clergy member, and both paid about the same. So I might tell you a little bit why it was a little bit of a problem for people to try to figure out which one they're going to do. So he said, no, the clergy should not be attracted there because of wealth. Instead, let's make our clergy, give them enough to eat, but let's not make them wealthy. So only the pious, the God-fearing men would go take this profession on. He said that men that in mortal sin were not entitled to execute authority in the church or state. So he said if somebody is committing a mortal sin, we won't get into what that is, they do not have any authority at this point on. And this was a problem for the Catholic Church. His followers, especially down the road, were called the Lollards. And that's an interesting word if you want to study the Lollards. They're an interesting group of people. And they continue on to the 16th century. So for the next 300 years, they continued to go around preaching the teachings that John Wycliffe had. In 1377, Wycliffe's ideas of lordship and church wealth came in conflict with Pope Gregory the 6th. No, the 11th. Gotta think through this. The 11th, and he was kind of excommunicated at that point in time. He was not killed, but if he would have lived long enough, he would have been. He died not that long after that. Was it 7 years after that due to natural causes? Years later in the Reformation, they dug up his bones, they burned them, then they threw the bones into the river for two reasons. Number one, make sure he does not come back to life. Number two is they did not want anybody to be able to look at his place of burial and have it kind of a holy site. They wanted to get rid of this man, erase his memory. And they probably thought they had accomplished it when they threw his ashes in the river, but we're still talking about him many years later. John Wycliffe is sometimes called the morning star of the Reformation. If you look out the sky in the morning, you see a bright star, often it's Venus. The morning star, he's the morning star of the Reformation. He's the first one that kind of starts this Reformation going. That's in a way, there's others that played an important part in this as well, but he is an important man, John Wycliffe. Next one is John Huss, or John Hass. It depends on your pronunciation. He's just a little bit later than Wycliffe, but the biggest thing that separates him is about 1,000 miles. Not so much time, but 1,000 miles. He's over here in Czech Republic, right up in here in Prague is where he's at. Over here is where Wycliffe was at. Halfway from London to Bulgaria. So he has influence more, get back here. He has much more influence on the churches in this area. And he starts preaching. He's a priest. He starts preaching. He decries the abuses in the Catholic Church. At this point in time, the Catholic Church was very abusive of their power and not very spiritual, which would seem odd, but they were not so much. His followers elected their own pope. They said, the Roman Catholic Church, you are an apostate church. We're going to replace you with a true church. They elect their own pope. Sometimes it's called an anti-pope. And they were going to start their own church. John Huss was asked to attend a council so that he could discuss his ideas. He was guaranteed free passage. He had free passage there. Apparently, the guarantee did not include free passage back home because when he got there, he was arrested and he was put on trial and then burnt at the stake for his faith. This starts the Hussite Wars when his followers, known as Hussites, saw what happened to John Huss. They said, okay, we're going to not stand for this. A bunch of riots and stuff in the streets. Eventually, the Hussite Wars begin. Roman Catholic Church sent armies in to conquer these Hussites, and there was 5 different kind of conquests in, and they were all repelled. The Hussites won every single one. The Hussites, John Huss's followers, had a kind of a question, and they had the vision down the center of, will we fight to protect our lives, or will we die for our faith? Many of them, probably 70-80% of them, decided to fight for their faith, fight for their lives, and they defeated Rome. The small group decided, no, it is wrong to take up the sword. Jesus said, you will bear the sword in vain. It's wrong for us to take up the sword, and we would rather die for our faith than fight for our lives. They become known as the Moravians. If you know anything about Moravians, they're known for their missionary efforts. For the next 400 years or so, 500 years after this, actually more than that, 500-600 years, they were known as missionaries, and they did a lot of missionary work in this land among the Indians. There was more missionary work done among the Indians in this country by the Moravians than any other group. They converted large sections of the Indian population to Christianity. This is actually a Moravian guy who wrote this book 400 years ago. He wrote this book. It's kind of like Pilgrim's Progress, if you're familiar with that allegory style. It's a good book, especially the last couple chapters. It talks about what is a Christian. And he does a very good job at defining what a Christian is, according to the Moravians, according to Hussites, and it would line up very well with what we think as Anabaptists, how we see a Christian. So yeah, that's an interesting book, especially if you like that style of literature. They become known as the Moravians, and the Moravians continued on. There's still Moravian churches today, though in the last 200 years, the Moravian church has kind of lost its steam. And in the last 200, 150 years, it's lost its steam, and in the day it's kind of a dying church, and it's not doing much. The question is, how do you get your message out? If you are an early reformer, how are you going to get your views out to the population? Yes, you can preach in your church, but that's maybe 100 people. And the people in your church don't travel. They're peasants. They don't travel. They don't write. They're illiterate. And your message will die with your church. And there were many, many, many reformers or good priests who preached the gospel to their church and led good, solid, Bible-believing, holy churches throughout the times when the Catholic Church was doing very poorly. But the Reformation didn't start with that. It kind of started in their little area, stopped in their little area, because they did not have a way of getting their message out. Today we have social media. At that point in time, if you wanted to get your message out, it was write it down, send letter, write it down, send letter, write it down, send letter. That was the only way. There was no printing press. There was no way of getting it out until the printing press came along. 1450. This was after the time of Wycliffe, after the time of Huss. The printing press is invented by John Gutenberg. John Gutenberg is not a jack of all trades. He's a master of all trades. To do this, to make this printing press, he had to develop a movable type, a type that you could take and select letters, put them over here, and then print with those. The letters have to be carved in reverse. Can you think how hard it is to carve when you write letters? Can you imagine writing that in reverse so that when you take a mirror image of it, it looks right? So he had to carve all these letters in reverse. He had to develop a new metal alloy for this movable type that it wouldn't smash and just kind of get all nasty. So you can read it. He had to invent a new alloy. So he had a new concept, movable type, a new alloy to make the type work. He had to create a new ink. He was a chemist as well. He created a new ink so that it would work on this new type. And he had to create a new paper that didn't just smudge when you clamped it down. Yeah, he was a master of all trades. One of the great inventors of our time was John Gutenberg. And he creates the printing press. That gives people like this, Erasmus, a chance to get his views spread throughout the world. Well, at least the known world. You can write something down now, and in a few hours they can print, send out thousands of copies when before you were sending out 5 copies. And with the advent of the printing press, now people have something that they can read and they can learn to read. And so now you have the general population learning to read. And so they can read these little pamphlets that get sent out. Erasmus is a Catholic. He remained a Catholic. He never left Catholicism. He was very strong on Catholicism is the true church all his life. So why do I have him in here as a reformer? Well, a couple reasons. Sometimes it says that he laid the egg that Luther hatched. That's something that's been said throughout years, and in many ways it's true. He was often sickly and wrote from his sick bed many, many times. Most of these reformers were sickly men for a couple reasons. Number one, the population at large was very sickly. It was not a healthy population in Europe at this point in time. Number two, oftentimes people who are sick and can't go out and work will turn to trades of the brain, of the mind, and they will learn to study instead of hard work because they are not well, healthy, strong men. He believed in Christian humanism. What's Christian humanism? Christian humanism says that God gave you a brain, and God intends for you to use that brain to learn about Him and to learn about what you should do in life. Rather than, in contrast to this at this point in time, was you just simply do whatever the church tells you, and you don't think for yourself. And so there's a contrast there. He believed in, and he taught Christian humanism. Now today, Christian humanism has developed into just humanism. We dropped the Christian part, and it's something very, very bad. It's human worship today. Christian humanism was mostly good. It had a twinge of maybe it's not going to end well, but it was mostly good. He preferred to stay and reform the church rather than divide it. A couple of things he taught was peace and peacemaking were key to his ideas of reform. And this did not sit terribly well with a Roman Catholic Church or a Protestant church that comes soon after this. Their ideas of using the might of the civil government to protect them or to enforce their views. He emphasized morality as a mark of true Christians. And he said later on about the Reformation, he says, the fact that your people are not more than what they were before is a sign that this Reformation is not of God. my words, not his, but he wrote extensively about that to Luther and some of the others. He compiled the Textus Receptus. I was going to bring along again this morning. Remember that Greek New Testament I had a couple weeks ago? He actually took all the different texts that were from all different places around the world and he compiled them into that little book, the Textus Receptus. And that's amazing for one man to do. There were other people that started the work and didn't really complete it, and other people that modified it after him. I know what you're going to say. So, yes, there was other people that played a role in it, but he was the one who really compiled it into that one little book that we have today. So he had a very big part of it. Probably about 80% of it was done before him, and the last 20% he did, and then there was corrections later on. Martin Luther was right in the time of Erasmus. They were contemporaries, though Martin Luther's a little younger, and he lives a little longer. Starting off with, him and Erasmus were best buds. They wrote together and they liked each other and they talked quite a bit. But it was very soon Erasmus started to have some reservations about this Luther guy. Maybe today we call him this Luther punk. Luther was a very antagonistic man, and Erasmus would rather sit in the back corners thinking. And that doesn't necessarily go well together. In 1517 is what is considered the start of the Reformation. These other men are sometimes called pre-reformers. And Martin Luther fastens the 95 Theses on the church door. And you'll often see a picture, I don't know if I even have that picture in here now, I might have later on, with a man pounding the nails through paper on the church door. Well, that's not really the way it happened probably. Most likely he brought a glue pot along, smeared the back of the paper with glue, posted it on the door, and that's how they would fasten things to the church door. The church door was the bulletin board. That's where you would put anything from announcements, anything else, you would put them on there. I think probably the picture has a man hammering a nail because that's a little more manly to be pounding this nail into the church door rather than walking up with your little glue pot and spreading glue on the back of the thesis. But yes, he fastens his 95 Theses on the church door. Luther is not intending to start Reformation at this point in time. He's trying to reform the church. And if you read the 95 Theses, they're fighting over that? A lot of them are just, what in the world is all this about? But anyway, we'll keep going. Luther was a pious monk. And like Erasmus, and like Wycliffe, and like John Huss, many others, he was distressed by the carnality in the church. Priest did not necessarily mean, to be a priest did not necessarily mean you were a holy man or you were a God follower. It simply meant you had a position. And they said, how can you claim to be men of God when you live such carnal, evil lives? He just could not grasp this. And he was distressed by this, especially after a visit he had to Rome, where he thought, well, okay, in Germany, it's bad, but if we got to Rome, it's going to be a holy city there. And then he took a journey to Rome and saw it was even worse there. And he came back very, very distressed. He had a very sensitive, or could say an overly sensitive conscience. During his early years, he wore out his confessor, the man he would go and confess his sin to him, coming to him sometimes dozens of days, confessing every little sin. Maybe he stumbled when he was walking and whatever else, and just drove his confessor nuts. And his confessor finally said, go read the Bible. Maybe you'll figure something out there. Radical thought. He never read the Bible before, so he goes to read the Bible, and he comes across this phrase, by grace you are saved through faith. And he latches onto this and he says, yes, I'm trying to earn my salvation. No, it's through faith. And so he takes this phrase and runs with it. And that's the beginning of Martin Luther, not as a priest, but as a reformer. He starts well, but he doesn't really end well. We'll keep going. Some of the things that Luther got wrong, one of the things that early on that he missed, and this is a quote right out of the Hindenburg Disputation that he had a year after, not quite a year, 6 months after his hammering the 95 Theses on there. He says, he is not righteous who does much, but he who without work believes much in Christ. For the righteousness of God is not acquired by means of acts frequently repeated, as Aristotle taught, but is imparted by faith. The law says, do this, and it is never done. Grace says, believe in this, and everything is already done. Well, it sounds good. Let's dive into this a little bit. What does he mean by that? I'm taking this quote out of context, so I have to give you the context. He is borrowing the concept from Aristotle and a few of the Greek philosophers that what you think, what you believe, and what you do are totally separate things. And he's saying, so therefore what you do has no merit whatsoever. Only what you think, what you believe, what you give mental assent to, that's the only thing that matters. And this was kind of maybe the first downfall that Luther had. He's taking this idea of by grace you're saved through faith, and he's declaring that faith means simple mental assent. Say you believe it, and you've got it. That's something very different than what the church had taught prior to that time, or what many in the church has taught at that time, that faith is actually a lived out belief. You can't separate works, the things that you do, the operation the thing you would do after you believe something, from that belief in itself. If I say, I believe this chair will hold me, and I just stand here all day long, do I really have faith that it's going to hold me? I have faith once I sit down. And the whole Hebrews 11 talks about this, that faith is taking what you believe and putting it to practice. That is faith. Luther did not believe that. In fact, he didn't think very highly of Hebrews because it contained Hebrews 11. He also did not think very highly of the book of James because it also talks about this link of faith and works. He said the book of James is worse than straw. It's not fit to be in our Bibles. It ought to be burnt. And some things like that. They're interesting. He did believe in the unification of the church and state. He said the state is there to protect the church, and the church is there to work underneath the state or work above the state, kind of depending on what part of his life you talk about. But he said the church and the state is one. They should be held together. So the church does the state, and the state does the church bidding. The state is there to protect the church. If the church says this person must die, the state must kill them. That's what he would have taught. Okay, another one of the cast is John Calvin. He was a French theologian who moved to Geneva. Again, he was sickly, often and bedridden, and often wrote from his bed. He was a powerful preacher when he was well, and early on especially, he preached a lot. He was an extensive writer. He probably has written more than most historical figures in his lifetime. 95% of what he says is very good, and 5% is kind of very bad. So yeah, when we talk about Calvin, don't throw him out as a antichrist, but also don't buy everything he has to say. He also links the church to the state. In his mind, they are the same. Just like the Catholics would have taught they're the same, he is linking them as well. There's many other reformers. Some lesser-known reformers are right here. I'm not going to read all the names because who is it? Do you know all the names of the cartoon figures I put up there at the beginning? Probably not all of them. But you know who Donald Duck is. Can you name all his nephews? I can't now. So yeah, you got them. So some of these people here, if you want to study deeper, these are some people that are interesting to study. We'll keep going. Ulrich Zwingli. He's another one. He is part of the Swiss Reformation. There were other Swiss reformers as well, but he's the one that becomes the most well-known. He is a preacher primarily, a pastor. He's a pastor to the peasants. He is not so much of a writer or a thinker. Like I said, John Calvin, 95% of what he wrote was good. Zwingli, a lot of what he wrote is questionable. Not a great thinker, but he is you could call him a populist. He is somebody who appeals to the population and they embrace him, and he's a powerful speaker. He starts the Reformation among the Swiss. He is probably one of the most bloodthirsty of all the reformers. Anybody who disagreed with him, he was very quick to send out a death warrant on that person. And he's responsible for the death of many, many, many people who claim to be Christians like him, but disagree with him, and he would find ways of getting rid of them. One of the things he is famous for saying, he says, I will die for the gospel and for the Reformation. In the end, Zurich is being attacked, the city he's in, and he goes to lead the battle as a chaplain, maybe you could say more as a general. He goes to lead the battle and is defeated. And he does not die because of the gospel. He does not die because of the Reformation. He dies in battle representing Zurich. And yeah, there's a lot of things about Ulrich Zwingli that are not good. But he does start a Reformation in his area. Switzerland is very mountainous. We all probably know that. And it's not an easy place for ideas to penetrate. but it is that place that ideas can incubate, and it does incubate there. So he starts the Reformation in that area. This brings us to Swift's Anabaptists. These were some of the young men who study under Zwingli. Zwingli is not a good thinker, is not very strong in the mind, but these men were brilliant. Conrad Grebel knew 7 languages very well. I think it was 7. 7 languages very well, very fluently. And he is only about 24, 25 years old. I think he's got us all beat. There's probably at least 7 languages in this room, but not one person has 7 probably, unless you do. But most of us do not have 7 languages. He was a brilliant linguist, brilliant thinker, and he studied under Zwingli. Very early on, George Blarac, another one, kind of became the leader of this group and about 5 or 6 more people. These are the well-known ones. He became their leader. George Blarac. Blarac means blue coat. So you see he has a blue coat on, and he always wore a blue coat. And so they didn't, and as history just refers to him as George with the blue coat or George Blarac. That's where he gets his name from. He's kind of like Peter. Think of Peter the Apostle. He's one that's out there ready to say something right away. One of the things he was known for is he would go into a church on Sunday morning and go up front and tell the pastor or the priest, "You sit down, God told me to preach today," and he'd preach a message. And then as soon as he got done, 10 minutes later, he runs quickly because he knows when the pastor didn't sit down, he wanted to get authorities, and he runs out of town and escapes before they get there to arrest him. That's one of the things he was known for. Yeah, he's kind of like Peter. Michael Sattler, he's the thinker and the writer of the group. And he writes the Schleitheim Confession, or we think he did anyway, and we will get to that in a little bit. Felix Manz, I'm going to say he's the organizer of this group. He's the one who takes care of the little details. They had a debate with Zwingli, and one of the problems was baptism. And they said, these men here said, baptism is for believers only. It's not for the infants. And Zwingli says, well, I kind of agree with you, but we are going to not push this Reformation too fast. We'll let the authorities decide. And the response that they said was, how can we let the authorities decide what God has already decided? And so they broke from him at that point. They meet in Felix's house, and they're trying to figure out what to do now. They just broke from this powerful man. What's going to happen to us now? And they're praying, and George says, Conrad, baptize me. If we believe this, let's turn this into faith. We believe that baptism is for those who are believers. Let's turn to faith. Let's actually baptize me. So Conrad Grebel does baptize George Blarac, and George Blarac turns around and baptizes everybody in the room. This is the first time you will see believers' baptism, or adult baptism, in any major way. It happened, yes, it happened, and there was other reformers that did it. But this was the time that it kind of stuck in the Reformation. The Schleitheim Confession, 2 years later, they got together. They said, we got to figure out what we believe. And so let's write it down a little bit. And they wrote the Schleitheim Confession down. It was 7 points. Did I put that in here? I thought I did, but maybe we'll get to it. They wrote it down and said, this is what we believe as a group. And this is what holds us together. They were heavily persecuted. From very early on, they were persecuted. Within a year and a half, most of that group was dead, of those 3 men. And within 5 years, I think they all were dead. They were all in their 20s. Felix Manz, I think, was about 25, 26 at the time of this dispute. They were all young, and they started a Reformation, right? And they started a movement right there. They fled to Germany. Their fathers fled to Germany and then throughout Europe. One of the ways that they would spread was they would send out a team of 3 men, usually young men, but 3 men. One would be a preacher, one who could speak well. One would be a deacon, one who could take care of administrative things well. And one would be an athlete or a runner. Why do you have an athlete or runner on there? Well, when they're sending people out, they know you're not going to survive, or most likely not going to survive. So they would go into a town. The preacher would stand up front in the public square and start preaching. The deacon would try to be working at taking care of anything, helping the poor, whatever else. And the runner would kind of stay in the shadows. In many ways, he had the harder job because the deacon and the preacher would have each other. But the runner would stay in the shadows because he's watching. Because he knows at some point, those 2 men are going to die. They're going to kill him. And his job was then to turn around and run back home and tell them, okay, they killed Jake and John, we need to send more. And then he'd return more, back with 2 more. Interesting that they had that much commitment that they would send an extra person along in their teams because they knew the first 2 were going to die. And they did. And it's interesting, I was reading through this book here. A number of times you have 3 men sent to a town or go to a town and 2 are killed. It's just recorded over and over and over again. The third one, he was a good runner. They couldn't catch him. He got away. He went back and got more missionaries to come back, try again. The lifespan of a pastor was less than 2 years. Average lifespan. So you select a pastor, 2 years later, he's dead. Select another one, 2 years later, he's dead. But they said that there was never an absence of able leadership. Sometimes all the men were killed and the women would take over. But there was always somebody ready to step up and say, I'll take leadership here. Yeah.
Is the preferred method of execution burning in this case?
We don't have any little ones here. 3 main ways. One would be burning at the stake, and usually that was done live. They would tie it to a stake, hands behind your back, put a firewood, light it, and you die that way. Second was beheading. Oftentimes women were beheaded, not always, and people who recanted were beheaded often. But that was another way. And some towns just did not have the bloodthirstiness to actually watch somebody suffer in the flames, and they would behead. The third one was drowning, and they would tie a large stone to your feet, chuck you off a boat, and you would drown. That's the primary 3 ways. There was lots of other gruesome things that they used to torture people to try to get them to recant. I'm not going to get into that if you want to read it or what you talked about, but it's pretty gruesome. So we'll leave that where it is. But yes, that's the 3 main ways that they died. So you had the Swiss Anabaptists were in the south here. Up north, I thought I had a map here. I guess I don't. Up north in the Netherlands is another area that Anabaptism starts to kind of spring out. After the Swiss Reformation and the Swiss Anabaptists, then Anabaptism starts to move very quickly. Some people would say that it popped up all these different locations by itself. Other people would say, no, it spread out of Zurich. I kind of take the view, I think it spread out of Zurich. It just seems like that fits better with history, but I'm not going to here debate that in a big way. And in Dutch, it spread among the middle class. This is not the peasants down there, it's middle class. Primarily, the Anabaptists were middle class. No matter where you go, they were middle class primarily. They were educated. In Dutch and Netherlands, there was less persecution. You may have to pay a fine, you don't lose your life, primarily. Sometimes they did lose their lives, but primarily it was not. One of the reasons why there was less persecution there was most of the doctors were Anabaptists. And you don't want to kill off all your doctors, right? You don't want to kill all the doctors off. And so if you're going to kill all the doctors off, if you're going to persecute these people, then the doctors are going to be dead too, and then you're going to have problems. So for the most part, there'd be a fine that'd be levied, not death. The North was more prone to mysticism, the idea of, do you know what mysticism is, or mystical thinking? We don't know, we just kind of believe, and lots of different things like that. You would have different spirits that they would think about, and a lot more mysticism. We'll get into that a little bit here later. One of the things that happened that was the Dutch Anabaptists really helped the Swiss brethren was they would pay for their escape and give them funds to escape. If it was not for the Dutch Anabaptists, the Swiss would be wiped out. Persecution was so stringent down the bottom, the south there, that they would have all been killed. But the Dutch did come to their aid and helped rescue many of them out. Menno Simons is somebody that is well known throughout Anabaptism, and he was a Dutch Anabaptist, and we'll get to him in a little bit. Well, why is baptism such a big deal? What does it matter if you're baptized as an infant or if you're baptized as an adult? Why is it such a big deal? Under Roman Catholicism, under the rest of the Protestant Reformation, you baptize a child as infant when it is born, or usually 7 days after it is born. A couple reasons. Number one, all the births were at home. You didn't go to the hospital. You didn't have any way of recording when this baby was born. And if you didn't have some way to record a new citizen, how are you going to take a census? How do you know who's born? What's your army? How do you tax? All these things. And so they would register the babies in the church scroll, church logbook. Oh, we baptized so-and-so, son of so-and-so and so-and-so on this date. And then they know that this baby was born. And they can go back 20 years later and take them for their army or tax them, whatever you need to do. Refusing to be baptized was considered a threat to the social fabric of the kingdom. If you refuse to baptize your children, that means they don't know how to tax. They can't take your children for the army or anything else they need them for. And so it creates a problem. And this was a debate that's going back and forth. Do we baptize infants or do we not baptize infants? And they could not really find a good way to take a record of all the infants if it was not baptism, because the parents have to willingly bring them, and no parent is going to willingly bring their child to be entered into the tax rolls from future on out. But if it was tied to this child's salvation, then they would. When you were baptized, it's considered the church was your master. And the Anabaptists said, no, the church is not our master. God is our master. Jesus is our master. And so we are going to give our allegiance to Jesus only, not to the church, not to the nation. And so they refused to be baptized as infants, or the parents refused to baptize their infants. So it did create a huge problem. Anabaptism grew rapidly. Within 5 years, it was somewhere between 10,000 to 40,000 people that were Anabaptists. Compare this to last week, we talked about the early church. It took 150 years to hit 40,000. So it grows very rapidly. Those numbers are hard to come by, so you'll find debate on that. There are many scholars. Ludwig Hartzler, as it would be pronounced today, they changed the spelling, and Johann Dank, translated the Old Testament prophets 3 years after the start of the Anabaptist movement. This was before Luther did it. Luther actually borrowed their translation and incorporated into his Old Testament. So yeah, early on they were educated, they were thinkers, they were very well schooled. They were intensely persecuted. From early on, they were persecuted. A few years later than what we're talking about right now, Bloody Mary of England, if you've read any of that history, she killed lots of people, thousands, if not tens of thousands of people for their faith. And it's estimated about 80% of those martyrs were Anabaptists. Just thousands, probably. We don't have good numbers, but probably thousands of people she killed that were Anabaptists. Everyone that was not part of the Protestant church or the Catholic church was considered Anabaptists. Remember this tension, because are you going to vow your allegiance to the church or not? So anybody who did not want to vow their allegiance to the church would not be baptized or would be rebaptized. And so you have lots of different groups that are practicing adult baptism who are not really part of the Swiss way of thinking. This includes mystics, humanists, Unitarians. Unitarian Church today started way back then. They would have not practiced infant baptism either. And any revolutionary out there that did not want to be associated with the ruling parties would be rebaptized, and they're an Anabaptist. Then that leads us to one of these. Here's one of these revolutionary type groups. This person, the leaders there were Anabaptists. They were rebaptized, though they had nothing in common with the Swiss Reformation, and really had nothing in common with the solid church in the north. Conrad Grebel actually wrote to one of the leaders and said, well, the way you're doing it is totally wrong. This is not the way of Christ. One of the issues in the Striking Confession was the idea of military force, and these people took over a town with military force. And so yes, they were not at all identified with the Swiss. They were up in the Dutch area more. They practiced polygamy. They saw the sword as important as the word of God. They saw the sword and the word of God as equal. Rebellion was squashed, leaders were killed, and they were placed in these cages. These cages actually still hang from the church steeple today. They took them down once, refurbished them, put them back up again. As a warning to any future Anabaptists, don't come here. Put them in those cages, and the birds ate their flesh, and their bones were in there. Today, their bones are gone as well, because bones don't survive even out in the air for 500 years. And the Catholics and the Protestants both looked at Munster and said, watch out for these Anabaptists, because that's what they're going to be. I'm going to put some distance there. I'm going to say these were not at all the Anabaptists of the Swiss Reformation, or of the God-fearing Anabaptists. These were the revolutionaries, you could say the mystical revolutionaries, that tried to find harbor underneath the wings of Anabaptism. But they weren't really Anabaptists. Menno Simons, he's a pious priest, and he sees this happening in Munster, and Munster as it's sometimes called. And he's having some problems with this. And prior to this time, he really starts questioning the doctrine of transubstantiation. Does the flesh and does the bread and the cup become flesh and bone of Jesus? He's questioning this. He was disturbed by the Munster incident. His brother was there and was killed in the gathering there. And he becomes an Anabaptist and becomes a stabilizing anchor in the movement. He travels extensively. He writes extensively. He was pursued by the authorities all his life, but he died a natural death. Many times he just barely escaped his life. In fact, one time probably he was going out the back window as authorities were barging in the front door and he escapes. Another time he met somebody and met the men on horseback and they asked him, "Have you seen Menno Simons?" And he looks around and says, "I don't see him." Obviously not, he isn't Menno Simons. And so they continue on, and later on they figured out that they should have just arrested him on the spot. They didn't know who he was. Menno Simons stabilizes the Anabaptists in the north. And without him, they would continue to question what is the essence of who we are. He's one who actually brings a slight home confession and gets it into all their hands, so they all know what the Anabaptists had agreed on. But anyway, he becomes a stabilizing factor. Let's look at the cultural landscape a little bit here. And we got to quit pretty soon. You have the peasants up in the north, up in the top here. The peasants were oppressed people, but during this time, the peasants are saying, well, why can't we be like the middle class? Or why can't we be like noblemen? And so you have a lot of peasant revolts. And many of these peasants get rebaptized as a symbol that we are no longer under your authority. So you have the peasant rebellion that's going on here. You have the mysticism in the south, down here, in the bottom here. Mysticism says, well, you just don't understand. I had a vision, and this vision says this, or they appealed to many other things. They had their rabbit's feet and their little things, their charms that they would use for the protection of all this thing. And so you had this mysticism that was pretty strong at that point in time. You had the Protestants. Here's a picture of Luther banging the nail in, fascinating he looks like a strong young man ready to conquer the world there. A little more than if he had a glue pot pasting up there. So you have the Protestants. They were in many ways your thinkers, primarily. There was thinkers in all these groups, but they were your thinkers and said, by our minds, we can know truth. And then you have the Roman Catholics down the bottom here, and their idea was, we like it the way it is. Nobody upset the fruit basket. Let's just kind of keep things the way they are. They're great the way they are. Things are good.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Are we going to have a little break?
Huh? We're going to get a break soon. The progressives, Zwingli and the Peasant Revolt. These are a couple things that kind of show what they believed. They were optimistic. If we believe it, we can think it, it must be true, we can achieve it. They looked at the Bible as a living, changing document. We can understand it better today than what you understood it yesterday. And so therefore, we have a better understanding and a better concept of what Christianity is. Their idol, I'm going to put their idol, is their creative mind. They thought, if we can think, we can have it. And they were in strict reaction to fundamentalism. Actually, that's not right. Yeah, fundamentalism, yeah. They did not like the fundamentalism too much of the rest of the reformers. Yeah, the mystical, Munster rites. Couple of things. One of the epistemology, that's a big long word. The idea of how do we know what's true? They said, why would I want to know what's true? If we just pursue truth, we ruin the experience. So we don't even care about truth that much. Kind of an interesting way of thinking through life. Their idol was their personal experience. Some things with the Munsterites, the mystical people. The Catholics were traditional. Just keep it the way it always was. We'll all be happy. I know because my culture tells me it is true. And if it's always been true for my dad and my grandpa, it must be true for me too. They were reacting to the mystics many times. They had an ethnocentric gospel, meaning it was about anybody who's in ethnically. A couple things there. You have Bible and culture. Bible tells us something, but our culture tells us something too, and both those are true. And we have to find a way to merge them. Fundamentalism, Luther and the Reformed. They had a very strong biblical viewpoint. Good things there, but they took the idea of whoever has the most credentials Whoever can make the best argument must be right, must be correct. And if they are correct and anybody disagrees with them, then the ones who disagree must be eliminated, because you can't have truth and error together. You must eliminate them. They reacted to the progressives. So then you have the Anabaptists. Anabaptists are a group, yes, but it's a philosophy more than a group. It's a way of understanding the Bible. And we had this last week. The essence of man is found in the creation of God. The essence of Christian is found in his rebirth in the image of Christ. It's not about idealism of the progressives. It's not about personal revelation of the mystics. It's not about theology of the fundamentalists or culture of the traditionalists. It's about Christocentric regenerated discipleship. So they stood on. We have the same people today. We had the progressives. If we can believe it, we can think of it, it must be true. We just have to work for it. Guideposts. How many of you remember Guideposts? Last generation. They still publish it, but it's a very mystical view of Christianity. And I was trying to think of another magazine that's a little more current. I couldn't think of one, so put that one in there. They're mystics. Rick Warren, reaching for your dreams. How does that sound? Yeah. You have the traditionalists. It's a nice Christian family. You have the traditionalists. Just keep going the way we've always done it. That'll work. And you have the fundamentalists, the students. We're going to find out what's truth. We're going to camp on it and eliminate everybody else. We have those groups today as well. So, what is real Christian life? What is real Christianity? Is it any of these four groups? I'm going to say no. It's not the progressive, it's not mystic, it's not traditional, it's not fundamentalist. All of us have a leaning towards one of these viewpoints. We all have a kind of a hidden circle, a hidden idea to us that are a little more fundamentalist or a little more traditional. We all have that, but that's not what Christianity is. That's just part of our fabric of who we are. What is real life Christianity? Menno Simons, talked about him a little bit ago, he said this: true evangelical faith is of such a nature it cannot lie dormant, but spreads itself out in all kinds of righteousness and fruits of love. It dies to flesh and blood. It destroys all lust and forbidden desires. It seeks, serves, and fears God in its inmost soul. It clothes the naked. It feeds the hungry. It comforts the sorrowful. It shelters the destitute. It aids and consoles the sad. It does good to those who do it harm. It serves those that harm it. It prays for those who persecute it. It teaches, admonishes, and judges us with the word of the Lord. It seeks those who are lost. It binds up what is wounded. It heals the sick. It saves what is sound. It becomes all things to all people. It's the persecution and suffering and anguish that come for it for the sake of the Lord's truth have become a glorious joy and comfort to it. He said that is Christianity lived out. What is Christianity? It is a belief system. It is a definition. It is a definition, but it's also a lived out life. It's not just a belief system, it's a lived out life. And this was his way of understanding what it means to live out Christianity. Okay, next week we're going to, at the very end, we're going to work at kind of building a definition ourselves of what Christianity is. So you can think of that a little bit. We can borrow from these here or expand on them. But what is Christianity? A couple books real quick. Martyr's Mirror, I mentioned that in here. Oh, I had a picture up there. I was going to highlight it. I forgot it. This picture right here of Dirk Williams. I have it hanging in my living room, so you might have seen it there. That's where that picture comes from. It's a copy out of here. If you want to know how they made that picture, it's a very interesting idea. You can ask about it later. This book here is fairly difficult to read. Here are a couple other books. Drummer's Wife is one that's much more easy to read. It pulls stories out of there. On Fire for Christ is a fairly recent book, maybe 15 years ago, 20 years maybe. And it also pulls stories from there. It's written with a younger audience in mind, so it's written easier, and it also leaves out some of the gory details that this book here would have. It might say somebody died for their faith. It does not explain how they died, piece by piece. So that's a good one. And then this is one, a friend of mine, Marcus Yoder, he wrote this book, Cathedrals, Castles, Caves. It's also a very good book to help understand what Anabaptism is. I'm going to pass these back through. If you don't have one of these, take one. If we need more, I have some more ordered. So you can pass those back through. That is a booklet. Howard Bender gave a speech on the Anabaptist vision. What did Anabaptists believe? What made them tick? And somebody thought it was good. They wrote it down, published it. It's been in writing for the last 50 years. And then this here is that kind of definition of Christianity that I had up last week and this week. I'll pass those around as well. Bookmark, you can take one and put it in your Bible, wherever else. What is Christianity? Every generation has to define what Christianity is. And we can borrow last generation's definition, and that's good, but we have to make it our own. If we don't, we will simply fall into traditionalism. We have to own it each time. Okay, I will turn time over to you for a few minutes.